Thank you, Paul, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Western Wyoming Community College for providing the facilities for us today, and of course to the staff of Saturday University, because it's always a pleasure to come out and talk to people around Wyoming about Wyoming history. It's always been great fun. Today I'm going to be talking about the deaths of Wyoming coal, technology and energy change in Wyoming history. The important thing that I want to particularly impart in this presentation is that there have been at least two earlier times where coal came to an end in Wyoming. It hasn't been just this time since 2015 that coal has been in decline or collapse. And in these two times, I'm going to be talking about such things as why these deaths of coal have occurred, and in both cases, in the case of the first time that coal went into decline, it was the result of technological change. It was the result of new resources in natural gas and in petroleum products, and the ability to heat homes and to heat businesses with various fuels. And then the second time that coal met its demise was just a couple of decades after that, when the coal-fired steam locomotives were phased out, and the biggest market for Wyoming coal disappeared. So it's not. I'm not just talking about mining towns like Rock Springs, pictured here in 1904. But I'm also talking about or here's a mining town also up in Sheridan County, Dietz, in 1909, a photograph of some Swedish miners over at Hanna, about the turn of the century. But I'm also going to be talking about communities that relied on coal in an indirect way in Wyoming, because you didn't have to be necessarily a coal mining town to be adversely affected when the coal industry went into decline. There were lots of places that were railroad centers, and lots of those places that were railroad centers required a substantial part of their population to be involved in working in the shops that maintained those big coal-fired steam locomotives. And so when we begin with Wyoming Territory, in fact, Wyoming Territory being, as this map shows, the presence of the railroad requires establishment of a territory. And here's Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado, and then to the upper part you see Dakota Territory, and you have this long appendage, this big appendage to the left of Dakota Territory that was a county in Dakota Territory, and it really didn't fit with the rest of Dakota Territory, and so Congress took the advice of the Dakota legislature and took it away from South Dakota, or Dakota. Dakota wanted it taken away and turned it into its own territory. The fact is that already when this was occurring, the Union Pacific Railroad was already developing their shops and already establishing coal mines in across Wyoming. And here's a early photograph, 1868 photograph of Carbon, that became Wyoming's first coal town. It was a town that rose and fell with coal. And as you'll see throughout this presentation, the towns that managed to survive the death of coal in these two earlier occasions were those places who were able to diversify, who were able to get away from that total reliance on coal. And there were other places like Carbon here that clearly were not able to get away from that total reliance on coal. And those places went into complete demise. And if you go out to visit some of those places that are like they're like carbon or like some of the watering stops, like up on the hill between Laramie and Cheyenne, a little town of Sherman. It was a very small place, but a watering stop. You'll see that there's nothing left but foundations. And you see that throughout Wyoming. You see that all along the railroads, not only the Union Pacific Railroad across southern Wyoming, but the CB&Q across northeastern Wyoming, and the Chicago Northwestern across the central part of Wyoming. And so it's the towns that were able to diversify and saw that there had to be something done in lieu of coal that managed to survive. Places like Green River, that fortunately was able to gain the county seat of Sweetwater County, took it away from South Pass City in the 1870s. But it's places like that were able to continue and survive. Well, as the railroad built across Wyoming, the railroad workers and miners were the major portion of the new territory's population. It was a fairly small population, but by the time of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, and of course this photograph is a very iconic photograph of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Gee, how'd that guy get in there? I don't know. He looks kind of familiar, but at any rate, by the time the railroad was completed, Wyoming had a total population of 9,118 souls. And if you'll notice on this map, most of those people lived along the Union Pacific line. They lived along the line of the first Transcontinental Railroad in places like Cheyenne and Laramie, and as this map indicates, Rollins Springs, Green River, Bryan, Evanston, towns along that southern tier of counties, because that southern tier of places. And you'll notice that the counties in Wyoming were largely created as a result of the presence of the railroad as well. They were stretched from Montana to Colorado, with the county seats of those counties being right along that southern tier. And then of course you see the Union Pacific mining towns in the 1870s. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about the ownership of these mines, because sometimes these mines started as independent contractors opening the mines and then selling the fuel to the railroad. But soon into the 1870s, the major coal fields in Wyoming were owned and controlled by a wholly owned subsidiary of the Union Pacific company known as the Union Pacific Coal Company. Even places like Laramie, which was very near the Union Pacific Railroad, and of course Laramie's existence is owed to the presence of the Union Pacific Railroad. Even Laramie by 1933 had switched to natural gas. There was no longer coal being used in homes in Laramie, at least to much degree, after 1933. After 1965, I should say, after 1965, it became a university town for the first time, because steam locomotives were a thing of the past. There were no needs for these shops. These shops closed up. The employment levels plummeted at the shops. And this was at the same time that employment in the mines in Sweetwater County, Carbon County, Uintah County, employment in those mines were plummeting for the same reason, that no longer was there a need for coal for locomotion. Those coal-fired steam locomotives were being replaced by diesel. And so it had an impact on every town along the Union Pacific line, not just the mining towns, but also the towns that had the large shops. Here is Cheyenne, 1882, and notably in this kind of lithograph bird's eye view of Cheyenne, you'll note that in this time period, Cheyenne might be bragging about the fact that it's a home for the cattle industry, and and it's kind of on the edge of the frontier, but Cheyenne would not have existed without those railroad yards in the foreground. You see the railroad yards. They're not accentuated very much in this particular lithograph because they're trying to illustrate other aspects. But the railroad was, in fact, the largest employer in Cheyenne until World War II, when you count the trainees and everybody involved with Fort Warren and the Transportation Corps training and the Quartermaster Corps training. And then after the war, very briefly, the railroad returned as the major employer, but by 1953, Cheyenne was a government town. It was no longer a railroad town as it had been since 1867. Well, there were other places that, of course, were affected by the presence of the railroad, because the railroad also needed ties, and they needed to continually replace those wooden ties. Nowadays, you don't think of a necessity for wooden ties because the technology's improved dramatically, but these things were constantly having to be replaced. And here is a photograph of a tie drive down the North Platte River to Fort Steele, and here are lots of employees working for this contractor for the Union Pacific to provide ties to the Union Pacific. Well, I shouldn't just concentrate on the Union Pacific, because there were two other railroads that were really significant by the late 1880s in Wyoming. And one of them was the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy that came into Wyoming from the east, was credited with the establishment of Newcastle and Gillette, and eventually became a very important presence in the already existing community of Sheridan. But here's a photograph from showing the CB&Q maintenance crew in 1916. And this is just one shift of the maintenance crew in Sheridan. Now, it obviously wasn't as major a contributor to the economy as the transcontinental railroad crews were along the Union Pacific, but nonetheless, it was an important facet of employment in Sheridan County. And nearby in Sheridan County, by the end of the 19th century, a number of mining towns were established. These were mostly company towns, companies like the Monarch Coal Company and the Cleanburn Coal Company, and the coal company that was founded by Pete and Al Simpson's grandfather, the little town of Coy, K-O-O-I, was one of the coal towns in Sheridan County. They were, one of their main customers was, in fact, the railroad, providing again transportation coal for the railroad. Well, Chicago Northwestern came through the central part of Wyoming and was responsible for establishing my hometown of Lusk and Douglas, and the second permutation of Casper came into existence as a result of the railroad coming through. And indeed, facilities for the railroad were very significant to the location of these towns. And here is the Redwood water tank that still stands in Lusk, but it's there not for municipal consumption, but it's there to provide water to those steam locomotives on the Chicago and Northwestern line. Here are railroad workers in Newcastle, and then here is the town just up the road, the company town of Cambria, that came into existence in specifically to provide coal to the railroads in the northeast part of Wyoming. These towns were wholly owned company towns, and as Laramie moved from a coal or a railroad town to a university town, these company-owned towns just simply disappeared. By 1930, places like Cambria were closing down. They were not even, they didn't even leave buildings standing because if the railroad left a building standing, they would be taxed. And so as these towns were abandoned, they'd sell off the houses to local ranchers or to individuals that would scavenge the wood and utilize the wood for other purposes. But the result is that a lot of these towns, you see no trace of these towns except some foundations, because again, it was a tax liability if you had in a company town existing buildings. Well, here is the big contributor to the demise of coal in Wyoming, and it's not necessarily Mike Murphy's Dallas Dome oil field that did it, but it's oil and gas that in essence brought an end to Wyoming coal, at least as a locomotive fuel. Here's a photograph from the Dallas Dome, the oldest oil field in Wyoming, the first oil field in Wyoming, and up until 3 or 4 months ago, it was still producing oil. Not a lot, but it was still producing oil. And that's a pretty amazing record from 1884 up to 2016 to be producing oil. Here's another photograph of a rig. There's a little bit of environmental degradation going on in this particular photograph that probably the photographer, J.E. Stimpson, didn't pay much attention to when he shot this photograph about 1900. But boy, you can sure see the nice shiny pool of oil there in the Poposia River there along in Fremont County. Spring Valley over in the Uintah County, here's some examples of some of the very earliest oil derricks over there. And the reason I included this photograph in here is because it was thanks to the nearby presence of the railroad that they were able to haul in a lot of these timbers for the construction of these derricks. And here are these of course, railroad locomotives being fired by coal that eventually are going to be replaced by diesel from oil. Mines at Carbon closed in the 1890s. Here's a photograph, or actually there's a second photograph that's even a little neater, about shows a fire crew standing in front of another building that has just burned down. And I'm not sure what the object of that is, because here they're showing one in front of a building that still stands. So maybe they're demonstrating that they've learned their lesson. Maybe before, this is what happens, and now we know how to handle this outfit, and now we don't have fires burning it down. It's kind of inexplicable as to, I should have put in the other photo because it's kind of a dramatic contrast. But anyway, the mines closed in Carbon as the train changed as the tracks changed their locations. As we all know, coal mining was labor intensive, and here is another factor that brought about the end of employment, at least, or the lessening of employment in the mines, and that is the mechanization. Because by the end of the 19th century, mechanization was starting to come into the mines, and by the 1930s, these mines were almost wholly mechanized, where a crew of a tenth the size of the earlier crews could produce double the amount of coal in a given day. Well, coal mining employment in 1899 is 4,697 statewide. Here is a photograph of a crew at Hannah. But also during this period, the coal-fired steam locomotives are the prime haulers for passengers and freight, and most important for this presentation, the biggest customer for Wyoming coal. Here comes the end of the golden era of railroad building, and here is one of the vehicles that helped bring about the end of the golden era of railroad building, because suddenly we have automobile traffic that can replace trains for passengers, and trucks can replace trains for hauling freight. And this is Dr. Crook in Cheyenne, who is demonstrating his first car, the first car in Cheyenne. This is about 1903. Elmer Lovejoy had a car in Laramie 5 years earlier, but this is a photograph of one of the mass-produced ones from the east that Dr. Crook is showing off. Well, major coal fields in 1900, of course, there they are along the railroad lines. There are others that aren't included on this map, but suffice it to say that most of the production is coming from these particular places, from mines in these particular places. And of course, immigration formed the overwhelming number of miners. And that's a long and interesting story, particularly as it relates to Rock Springs, the international city with 58, let's see, what is it? Heinz has 57 varieties. 57, right? 57 ethnic groups had roots in Rock Springs. Well, here's another factor that contributed, albeit in a rather small way, to Wyoming coal's demise, and that is when the U.S. Navy decided to shift from coal-fired ships to petroleum ships. And I always like to throw this in because I think there's a little bit of irony in the fact that it's the Monitor Wyoming, afterwards renamed the USS Cheyenne, that was the very first conversion from coal to oil. And the battleship Wyoming, the keel was laid 1911. It was the first battleship that was coal-fired initially and then converted over to oil in 1925. So there's some amount of irony with the Wyoming Monitor and with the USS Wyoming shifting from coal to oil. Well, here's something that relates to nothing except the British Navy was doing the same thing. So I'm not implying here that the U.S. Navy is doing anything different with conversion from coal to oil. It's a worldwide phenomenon. 1910, here are a couple of additional coal mines, one in Jibo, one in Hudson, and still the primary fuel, the primary use for the fuel is locomotion, is transportation. But ultimately, as this photograph from Casper demonstrates, the death of coal the first time came at the hands of oil and gas for heating fuels. So while there was this gradual decline in coal-fired locomotives that didn't really come to an end until 1954, with respect to heating fuels, it started pretty early in Wyoming. It started pretty early with the first construction of pipelines from Salt Creek in 1910 and 12, but even the Midwest field in 1910, this is a postcard from 1915 of the field, but many of these fields already had pipelines servicing various Wyoming communities with natural gas. Grable is the first town in Wyoming that's hooked up to natural gas. This photograph is from Elk Basin in 1916, but some of the natural gas from the Elk Basin field helped convert Grable from utilizing coal for heat to natural gas. About the same time, Billings, Montana started receiving Elk Basin gas and converting their system to a natural gas system. By 1933, even Laramie had natural gas pipelines in from McFadden and from the Queely Dome field that converted Laramie over to natural gas. And this is at the time when the Union Pacific rail yards are still very much operational in Laramie, and yet natural gas pipelines are servicing heating for Laramie. I put that one in there because I like the picture. Statewide coal mining employment in 1922 hit its all-time peak. And what I mean by all-time peak is it didn't even hit 9,102 in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, in those boom times that we remember of the boom times in coal in the Powder River country and also in mines along the UP line. But 1922, we get this slow demise in employment, thanks to mechanization, thanks to the fact that even though production is increasing slightly during this period and really doesn't start to go into decline until the stock market crash of 1929, when railroads no longer needed a lot of coal because they were hauling less freight and fewer passengers. But as production rose, employment declined, and it continued to decline until the point where these mines, here is Hannah, 1920. By 1953, the mines are closed in Hannah. Cumberland, the mine closed in 1930. Again, these are communities that were, for all intents and purposes, one industry towns. And they're one industry towns because they were built by the railroad. They were, in some of these cases, wholly owned company towns, everything in town. You know, you owe your soul to the company store. That sort of operation would have been going on in these mining towns like Cumberland and like Hannah. Well, there are other company towns, though, that come into existence in the 1920s. And it's perhaps no accident that in 1923, the new company town of Parco opens up. And it's a planned community built around what's now the Sinclair Oil Refinery. It was the Parco Oil Refinery. And even though the Parco operations ran into some trouble in the 1930s and went into bankruptcy, and the whole operation, including the company town and the refinery, had to be sold at auction from the courthouse steps of the Carbon County Courthouse in 1937. The purchaser of the town and the refinery was a company owned by a fellow by the name of Harry Sinclair, and the town's name was changed to Sinclair soon afterward. What distinguishes Sinclair from a lot of these company towns that were coal company towns is that they continued to operate as a company town until such point as the company made the decision to sell off houses to their employees. And this is something that wasn't often done in the coal company towns. But in Parco and also in Midwest, both of them company towns, eventually by the 1950s, these places are continuing in existence and essentially allowing for their company towns to become wholly municipalities, organized municipalities with ownership of the houses and the buildings by local people. Well, let me hurry up because I'm running out of time here. Major coal fields in Wyoming by 1930, they're starting to decline in number, and production is starting to falter by 1930. There is a brief revival during World War II, and there is a pause during World War II in conversion of coal-fired locomotives to diesels. These are the women who worked on the railroad crews outside Laramie during World War II, happy or unhappy with the fact that once the war ended, their employment was ended because they were supposedly to make way for returning soldiers and go back home and not work anymore. And it's a real tragedy for the period that a lot of women who would have had established careers in these fields were sent home as a result of the end of the war. But the declines continued until the point that On the 28th of August of 1962, Rock Springs number 8 closed. It was the last UP mine to close down. And in essence, our friend Dudley Gardner, who wrote a book on the coal mining history of Wyoming a number of years ago, points to 1954 as actually the date when coal died in Wyoming the first time. And what killed it? Natural gas killed it. So too did the conversion to diesel locomotives. So he uses 1954, even though there were a few mines who staggered along in the 1950s and into the 1960s. But here are the new faces of energy by the end of the 1950s. These are the oil field workers, these are the drillers, these are the refinery operators. This is the new energy in the 1950s and 60s that replaced oil workers. And usually I go off on a segue into something else here, but I won't because my time is limited. But I usually talk about the fact that you have a completely different type of individual working in the oil and gas fields than you do in the coal mines. And suffice it to say that there were not a lot of coal miners who could easily make the conversion to working in oil and gas. So I'll just leave it at that. I won't go into detail about it. But when those miners lost their jobs in 1954, there were not a lot of mines to move to because it was happening all over the country. And they were not going to be retrained into any areas of energy because there were completely different types of practices. Well, here's coal mining employment in Wyoming in 1965. 327. 327. That is pretty much, a lot of those people were caretakers. A lot of them were simply getting by with selling small amounts of coal to local community steam facilities for electric generators in small towns. And then, of course, we get back, coal comes back. It isn't killed yet because along comes the Clean Air Act in 1970. And as we all know, it's the Clean Air Act that brings back Wyoming coal. It does bring back Wyoming coal because Wyoming coal is less sulfurous. It has not the kinds of sulfur content that coal from other states in the east have. And so all of the big power plants that were coal-fired started turning to Wyoming coal as opposed to having to put in scrubbers and all kinds of making all kinds of technological changes to accommodate the standards of the Clean Air Act. So the Clean Air Act, we ought to hold up as a real important achievement with respect to maintaining Wyoming coal, because it brought about that next boom in Wyoming coal that continued on through the 1970s, and of course aided and abetted by the Arab oil embargo, was a profitable way for coal to come back at least until 1982. And here we have power plants established all over the state, and these power plants are taking advantage of the Clean Air Act standards using Wyoming coal, of course. And then we get to the boom of the 70s, but the employment peaks at 6,140. Production is monumentally higher than it was in 1922 when employment was at its peak. But it's thanks to equipment like that where employment can be relatively modest for a big boom as the 70s gave us, a relatively modest, a little over 6,000. Well, let me move through here quickly. Here's something that I want to draw your attention to. It's a little hard to see, but it shows the valuation of minerals produced in Wyoming by year. And you'll notice we're jumping ahead now past the depression of the 1980s and 90s when it came to Wyoming energy. It was a depression period, and we all know about that. But look what happens in the year 2000. Look what happens in 2000. We have an assessed valuation in Wyoming of 3.4 billion for gas and only 1.3 billion for coal. And you'll notice that that trend continues on. I have at the high point, 2008, 4 billion for oil, 12 billion for gas, and a mere 3.8 billion for coal. And so I would point to this as the beginning of the next stage of the death of Wyoming coal. And it's brought about not by government regulation, but by the presence of new technology in the field of oil drilling, in the field of natural gas production, and the huge increase in pipeline capacity in Wyoming after 2008. And so we have fracking, and whatever you think of fracking, it did contribute substantially to an increase in oil and gas production in Wyoming. Horizontal drilling contributed, and of course coal bed methane in the early part of the 2000s contributed. Here's a coal bed methane well that would last about 5 to 7 years, but nonetheless contributed substantially to the energy mix in Wyoming. Well, by 2005, natural gas, high oil prices, strong coal production equal prosperity. And there's a table that I don't need to do because I'm totally out of time, I think. 5 minutes, okay. Well, in essence, coal was priced out of the energy market by 2008. I contend that coal was in its next steep decline, and coal was well on the way to being killed off by natural gas, killed off by oil, and killed off by their fellow industries right here in Wyoming, where citizens of Wyoming through severance taxes are earning not the same amount of money from severance taxes with natural gas and with oil as from coal, but nonetheless, it's our enemies of coal in 2008 in Wyoming are none other than ourselves, looking at our other industries that are located in places like Sublette County, which for the first time overcomes the assessed valuation of Campbell County in 2005 to become the highest assessed valuation county in Wyoming. If the license plate numbers were allocated by assessed valuation now, like they were in 1929, Sublette County would be number 1, and Campbell County would be number 2, and Sweetwater would probably be about where it is. So Albany wouldn't. Albany would be down there like 20th, but it's thanks to the presence of natural gas, of oil production, of pipeline construction, of world prices for oil, that by 2008 had coal very much on the run. Now, wind turbines are a really minor part of the story, but I put this in because my brother David was the editor of the Medicine Post and also worked with the Bureau of Reclamation to find the windiest place in Wyoming, and he found it up on Simpson Ridge near Medicine Bow, and that's where they built the world's largest wind turbines in the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation in the 1970s. But in essence, the ultimate question that I ask is rather than sticking our heads in the sand, or in this case, in the cannons, I hope I've lost a little weight since then, but anyway, my head has gotten a little larger, I think. But at any rate, my question ultimately is, can Wyoming stand by and wait for the next boom in coal? And of course, that begs a few questions. We knew that with the first boom, or the first bust, there was a way out, and that came in the form of the coal-fired power plants and the very fact that we had low sulfur coal. The second boom came to an end as a result of fracking and of horizontal drilling and better and cheaper ways of utilizing natural gas and oil. What's going to happen with with coal now? And that's the question I leave you all with. So thanks for your attention, and I'll turn over the show to somebody else.
Actually, we have about 5 minutes for questions. So
okay.
Phil, if you'd like to direct some questions to Phil.
Okay. Yes?
I was wondering if you thought that wind and solar might be the final death of coal.
And I'm taking a guess that might be. But Wyoming's done some really peculiar things lately, if I may step out of my University of Wyoming official hat and step into my hat as a private citizen and more or less a political critic. And that is, one of the peculiar things is in an attempt to try to make coal more competitive. I think that's the rationale behind it. I think a member of the legislature could correct me on this, but as a way of more or less preserving the ability of coal to compete, there was a tax applied on wind-generated electricity. It had a huge effect because it stopped wind farms in Wyoming. Now, if that was the intention, it worked. But that's the kind of effectiveness that you could also get by demanding that everyone in Wyoming remove electric lights out of their homes and replace them with kerosene. If you're really going to try to increase the viability of the kerosene industry, that might be a way to do it. Now, what that does to everything else, of course, is well, it's a silly example that I just dreamed up. So, but anyway, what we need to do is be embracing and encouraging all aspects. And I think we're going to have to look long and hard at what's going on in places like China that are closing coal mines, and wonder if bonding of coal ports on the West Coast is really going to work. Yeah.
So could it be said that the worst enemy of Wyoming's future is the state legislature?
Well, I think what you could say is that we're our own enemies, because we've been that way for a good 130 years. Because again, we get to these boom periods and we have this mistaken notion, and I'm as guilty as everybody else, that the boom is going to go on forever. Oh man, is this ever great? You know, we go through 13 booms, and unfortunately we've gone through 13 busts. And of course, when it comes to the bust, what do we do in the bust times? We say, oh no, we're in a bust. We can't spend any money. We can't do anything new because we're in a bust. When we're in a boom, what do we say? Well, why should we tamper with it? Because if we spend any money and try to diversify, it might ruin the boom and we'll lose it. So we're our own enemies.
My big concern now is that with solar and wind being what they are in the big market areas like California, for instance, pretty soon they're not going to need any energy from us of any kind at all, like in probably 5 years.
And that's why I think it's very important to get a source user of energy as the other mode of diversifying rather than a new source.
Yeah, that's why the timing of the wind tax really sucks. Because at that time we could have locked in long-term contracts.
That's right.
For wind energy. That time is past. So we really blew it.
Now we need to get some users.
Yes.
Some clean users.
Yeah, and they were available shortly ago, but I'm not sure
Yeah,
that's
I'm
the
not
case
sure
now.
even now.
Right.
And we might be a year or two too late even on that. Yeah.
I heard something, I got a Facebook thing, you know, great Facebook. And I believe it was from Senator Barrasso that said that up at Wyodak, they're trying some new technology that's supposed to pre-burn coal to make it cleaner once it goes into the power plant. Now, I only heard it once, and I'm kind of,
Well-
thinking, what the heck is going on?
Well, let me remind you, some people in here are old enough, not very many of you. I'm the oldest old guy in here, but there was this thing in the 1980s called Amendment 4. Do you remember, anybody remember the Amendment 4 program? That was a way to get us out of the bust, would be to use state money and loan it out to these kinds of innovative ways of getting out of trouble. So what happened is about 90% of the Amendment 4 money went over to companies that were guaranteeing ways to take coal and turn it into oil or something like that. And you'll never believe how many of those loans, those low interest state loans, were paid back to the state. Well, since 90% of them went to these energy operations, and I'm not implying anything here because I'm not giving an exact total, but the overall return on that loan program was roughly 10%, and the rest of them defaulted. Now, most of them were these operations that had these great new ideas, and it could be that this one is the one that's going to work. Ron Surdum from the geology department at UW and worked for the state has several proposals for taking care of CO2 by pumping it back in and getting rid of some environmental issues with coal. Perhaps that's a partial solution, but it's a little more complicated now than even when Professor Surdum started that project about 20 years ago. Yeah.
This is not much of a question, but I've worked at Bridger, I've worked at a lot of different plants around and helped build them. If you covered the state of Wyoming with wind farms and solar energy, you could not produce as much power as is being produced at Bridger right now.
That's right. That's right. There is, and the same thing can be said, by the way, of coal-fired steam locomotives. A lot of people in the 21st century think, oh, now we've really come a long way because diesel locomotives can really do the job. Well, some of those engines, like the Big Boy and even the Challenger, could outdo the most modern diesels, even strung three or four abreast, or three or four long, in terms of the power output. So your point's well founded.